Today we're going to be talking about a really powerful capability inside of CrafterCMS called the deployer processor. And specifically, we're going to be talking about custom deployment processors. So here we are on the CrafterCMS deployer documentation page in the 4.1 documentation, and we can see here that the CrafterCMS deployer is an independent process in the CrafterCMS suite of components. Now, this particular diagram is a bit of a logical diagram in a sense because the number of deployers that you have and where they sit depends on the deployment topology that you have. This particular diagram shows a sort of stateless delivery where a single deployer is putting content into a file system or bucket that is reachable by a Crafter engine. And in a sense, the Crafter engine doesn't need to know anything about deployment. It just reads these sources. And to the extent that the deployers put things in the right area, it's got what it needs. In some cases, that's because you have a single deployer putting content in like a bucket that many engines can read, or you've got a deployer that runs separately but alongside of an engine on a remote machine and is taking care of putting content on the file system and in the search index. Okay, so this diagram, 100% correct logically, but in some cases, it's implemented with more deployers if you're deploying to a file system on a remote machine. Now, how a deployer works is it has targets for each project. So it has individual sort of context, which we'll see. And for each context, it pulls a remote repository and it receives updates from the repository on that duty cycle. It then performs a set of actions through deployment processors. And there's a set of out-of-the-box processors. And then as we're going to learn, you can insert your own. So let's jump from this diagram to another diagram that I have here. So here's our deployment process. Now, as I mentioned, you're going to have a target for each project or site that you're managing that this deployer is taking care of. Okay, so a deployer can take care of multiple projects or sites. Let's remove that to keep the diagram clear. Now, what happens is that target on a duty cycle wakes up and pulls the remote. It uses out-of-the-box processors. It basically invokes a processor chain. It uses out-of-the-box processors to generate a diff between its last pull and the current pull. If there is something, then it goes on to do tasks like index the content into OpenSearch, maybe clear some caches, and then ultimately complete. So I've not included all of the processors here, just a few to show the out-of-the-box sort of steps. Now, what's really neat is you can define your own processor. So let's say that you wanted to push something to HubSpot or automatically deploy something to social media or send a notice to Slack whenever something's published. You could create a custom processor and put it in this chain of tasks. So for example, let's create a Slack notification. Okay. Then we're going to insert this into our processor chain. So complete would point to this, right? And this guy here, those arrows are terrible. Let's remove them. So this is custom, right? Now, how do we build those? We're going to go over to VS Code and we're going to start with a simple Groovy script. So I'm going to go over here. And the first thing I want to do is just start with the basic anatomy of one of these processors. So you can see this processor, if we wired it up and configured it, it would actually work. It would do things for us. And you can see that the first thing it would do is it would say, I'm invoking an example deployment processor. And then we have 3 loops that are basically each iterating over a different aspect of what's called the original change set. So there's various objects provided to the deployment processor that we can use to operate on what's changing, right? Because that's what we want to take care of. We want to see what's come to the deployer, and then we want to act on those changes. So they could be new images or new content or updated content or a delete. So you can see that you can get a list of files that were created, a list of files that were updated, and a list of files that were deleted. And then you can do things for those. And so you might want to notify Slack, for example, only when new content has been created. Or let's say you were inserting something into a database every time somebody was deploying content, you would create the record when content is in this state or in this list. You would update the record when it's in this list, and you would delete the record in the database when it's in this list. This is the basic anatomy of any deployment processor. Now, this is not interesting because it's too simple of an example. So let's go to another example here. And here you're going to see that what I'm doing on create, I want to say the file name that I'm creating, and I want to give the bytes or approximate bytes of that file. And the same is true on the update. Okay, so I have some file access. Now I could be doing something with the data inside of those files, but for now we're just going to list the number of bytes. So in order to get access to those files, we're going to have to do that the proper way because we have things that we need to think about when we're accessing files. One is the scripting sandbox, which is not going to give us direct access to things like files on the operating system. So we need a way to access the files securely. And the second thing that we need to think about is that there are different ways that files are deployed in Crafter. Sometimes they're files on a file system. Sometimes they're what we call blobs, and the file content itself is actually in an S3 bucket, and we're only getting the blob asset, the marker asset, which is an XML file at the deployer. So we need to be able to go get the bytes from the blob store, and we don't want to have to write that code ourselves. We want the system to take care of it. And the same is true if we're using what's called a remote data store. So that could be something like Box, S3, or other systems like that. So we want the system to take care of those things for us. Okay. So in order to do that, there's an out-of-the-box service called the Content Store service, and it will do most of those things for us. And to get that object into our deployment processor, we're going to perform the following actions against Spring, okay, because they're available in Spring. So we get the context factory, the content store service, and the context. We can generate that from the factory. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my own little helper class just to kind of clean up the code and hide some of the code and make it more reusable inside of my service. And this is a basic example of factoring code. Okay, I don't want one big script file here with thousands of lines. So I've created a helper class. Now I happen to have created that helper class down here in the same file, but this could be a real class file, a separate class file. It could be wired up with Spring. And I can basically factor this code to any amount of sophistication as required to keep it clean. All right. But in this simple case, all we want to do is kind of take some of that logic and abstract it from our main loop. So that's what I've done there. I also thought it would be useful to show you how you get some parameters from the configuration. So when we wire up this code into the system, I'm going to also supply a value, and I want to show you how to get that. And you can do that through application context.getEnvironment.getProperty. And you'll see that how that works in a minute. After that code, we get into the loop that we just saw in our basic example, where we announce that we're starting this processor. We're going to print out our configuration value. And then for created files, we're going to have a loop. And we're going to basically just get the asset input stream, okay, through the helper class that I created. And then we're going to print out the path and the bytes available. And ultimately, we're going to make sure that that input stream is closed. Then we're going to do the same thing for updated files. Okay, and that's just to show that you can do that. And then for deleted files, I'm not going to do anything. So I've commented that out. And then finally, we're going to announce that we are done. Okay. Now, let's look at this code here because this shows us how we can properly access the input stream of content that we are receiving in the change set, right? Because maybe we want to get values out of that content and put them in some other system. Or maybe we want to perform some kind of transformation on the object itself. Let's say it's an asset. Let's say that we want to go from an image to a PDF. We can use this approach to do that. Now, it's not the only place we can do things like that, but it's one of the places we can do things like that. So we're going to need access to that input stream. So if we go down here and look at this class, let's just start at the top. I've got the content store service, the context, and a remote asset pattern. I've got a constructor. And then here's the main show, right? Retrieve static asset. And we are sending in a binary path. We want to go through this method because this basically allows the code to work with the blob store and without. It secures the code. It doesn't assume that we have direct access to the file system. So it's something that we can do without the sandbox being turned off or something like that. And it also future-proofs our code. So as Crafter adds new ways to store and access files, by going through this mechanism, we make sure that our code works with that update. So inside of retrieve static asset, all we're doing is we're saying, oh, is this a remote asset? In this case, you can see I've actually just stubbed this out but the remote access is handled a little bit differently than blob store content. So I've stubbed this out, but there would be some additional logic here. For now, I've decided to make sure that this does not go through this path. And if I complete this method, then for now, I'll throw an exception and say I can't handle it. But then I could go and complete this. There's just I'd have to reach out to that remote store, whether it's Box or others, through some other mechanisms in Crafter, get that binary asset, and then return it. So again, trying to keep the example simple because this is really the way that most people store their content. It's either on the file system directly or it's in a blob store. So what we do is if we determine that it's not a remote asset, then we're going to go to the content store service and say, find the content for us, and we're past the binary path. This means that the content store will figure out if it's a blob object or not, and it will return the input stream for us accordingly. Then we're just going to check to make sure we got what we expected, and that's all there is to it. Otherwise, we're going to return that input stream. So this is the main point. Leverage this method to get your content safely from the blob store or the file system. Or if you're using a remote storage like Box, you're going to have to use a different accessor for that. Okay, so that's all there is to it. Now we've got the code written, right? Now we have to wire it up into our deployment processor. So you remember I mentioned that you have these targets. Well, this is an example of a deployment processor target. So it's for the site called T1. It's just test one. And you can see that it's monitoring this repository path. When it performs a pull, it performs a git diff, and then it will call a series of other processors. Okay, so without my custom processor, and just for a second here, let's just hide these. It would perform a diff, index that diff that creates updates and deletes. It would index those into OpenSearch. And then it calls some cache clearing on Crafter Engine. And then it outputs a message in the logs and completes the deployment process. Now, what we're going to do is say, okay, but before you do that indexing, we want to call our custom Groovy processor. So here you can see I'm actually pointing to the direct path of the script. Okay. And there's another way you can put these scripts in a specific path so you don't have to list the full path. I like to list the full path, but there is a a way you can just list the Groovy file and it assumes a specific path. And then you can see that we're going to exclude certain files. We don't even want to run on those. And we do want to run when we meet these patterns here. And so I'm basically saying I want to run anytime that I'm either a bit of content or a static asset. And don't run if there's a .keep file. So sometimes you just create folders and there's a .keep. So between these two, we can really narrow down when the processor runs. In this case, I want to fail the whole processor chain, the rest of the processors, if this processor fails. So this is an option you have. You can stop the chain or you can continue if your processor fails. And then the last bit of information in here is you can see I've created something called my custom params. I've created something underneath that called my param and given it a value. So this is a way that I can supply configuration into this processor. Okay, so going back to the code, you can see that we are going after target, my custom params, my param. And then the configuration, so target, my custom params, my param. All right, so once we save this file, this target will be loaded up in the deployment processor, and then we can see it running. And I'll mention this, I've got this running in preview. So all I have to do is upload a file, for example, in preview, and this processor will run. So it's not going to wait for me to publish content because I'm not running against the published repository. I'm running against the preview or the sandbox repository. It makes it easy to test. But if I wanted this only to run on an approved publish, I would change the repository that I'm looking at. Okay. Now let's get over to Studio. We're going to jump to this window here. I'm going to sign in. And what we're going to do is under images, I'm going to upload some new content. So let's click upload. So now we need to drop a file into here. So we're going to go to my file system and let me just create a new file here. Let's rename that and we'll call it Rus demo. And all we're going to do is drag this file into the uploader. It uploads. Now we can go back to our logs. What we see is that we are invoking our example deployer. Here's our target value. So it's a value, which is the value that we configured in the YAML file. And then you can see because we uploaded a new file, it's running the create statement inside of the create for loop and showing us the bytes or estimated available bytes from the input stream. And then it announces that the processor is complete. And then it goes on to perform the other actions. And that's all there is to it. And again, you can just see how powerful this can be in terms of enabling workflow or publishing to other platforms. It's an awesome capability inside of CrafterCMS.